Welcome to the world-changing podcast.
Was that too much? Yeah, that was probably too much. But let's keep it. We'll keep it anyway. How about this? If we do the podcast and the world doesn't change, then we can take that out. Welcome to the World-Changing Podcast, where we deconstruct the projects and products that are moving us towards a decentralized and carbon-free future. We'll talk to the skeptics, supporters, and innovators in the fields that depend on electricity to run their industries, which is changing every single day. I'm your host, Greg Robinson, co-founder of Aston Labs, a decentralized infrastructure company. And on the other side of the camera here, we have Flo Lumsden, our producer, and she will make sure that the train stays on the tracks while we do this. Are you recording?
I am recording.
Oh, all right then.
But don't worry about it.
I'm going to start first by introducing the producer of this fine world-changing podcast, Flo Lumsden.
Oh, thank you.
Flo Lumsden, over there. What I think is super interesting is I have this identity crisis of being like an artist and a musician in my life, but I basically have spent my entire life from like first grade until now thinking about electricity in some way or another, which we'll get into. And I think in some ways Flo is similar in the sense that her training and her interests kind of center around like global environmental politics. Like, how can you change the systems to make the world more environmentally equitable for people at the political level? But there's this through line in her life that kind of centers around art and mainly around like emotional storytelling, and really just communication and connecting with people, like at the just most fundamental level. So this sort of makes this a really cool match for us to bring these ideas that most of the time people don't really want to listen to in my everyday gatherings with friends, but Flo was nice enough to join here and
thank you.
And put this together. So Flo Lumsden, everyone.
Yay! Thank you for the introduction, Greg. I appreciate it. And now it's my turn because you are really the host of this podcast, and I will be helping to produce it and ask questions here and there, but you are our guide. And so we need to introduce you. We need to give you a formal introduction and really list all of your credentials, which I know you would probably not do for yourself. So Greg Robinson is a founder and CEO of Aston Labs. Mr. Robinson earned his BS in physics at the University of Washington in 2009. He began his professional career in 2009 in Seattle in product design, development, and distribution with Questar Energy Systems. After being issued a patent on behalf of Questar describing an improved electricity distribution network, Greg and Ed McKenzie, his work partner, a former Google and Microsoft software engineer, decided to develop the vision which underlay the patent, resulting in the formation of Drift Energy in 2014. Greg and his partners created an easy-to-use system for purchasing continuous renewable energy, the first of its kind, and built a team to operate and market it. Greg spent 7 years serving as chairman and CEO of Drift, along the way raising $13.5 million of venture capital from some well-known and prolific early-stage venture capital firms and angel investors. Both Fortune 500 and small companies relied on the Drift team to assist their sustainability leaders, even with the most aggressive environmental social governance goals, or ESG goals. In late 2021, Greg, Ed McKenzie, Drift CTO, and Ka Dang, is that correct?
Ka Dang, Drift General Counsel, with help and encouragement from noted successful investment professionals, started Aston Labs to ensure that no other company working to serve the basic needs of our modern technology-driven economy would be held back by an infrastructure network that fails to keep up with innovation. That is the formal bio. But Greg, what does all this mean? Who are you? I mean, I read this and I think you've raised legitimate capital from impressive firms
So people believe in you and what you're doing. You have a background in physics. You have worked with some of the best software engineers to create new and improved distribution of energy or electricity systems. And now you're on to your next thing, Aston Labs, which we will connect the dots, which I think is a really interesting story. But before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about who you actually are?
Yes. Yeah, I think with all the things you just said, the whole bio, I mean, I'm just basically getting started. I think that all of those things are required in order to even begin having the conversation about what has to be done. I mean, it's so deep, especially if we just focus in the electricity sector. Like, this started so long ago. The people who designed the network are no longer around to inform how it might need to change. So I think there's this general, I don't know if it's just fear, but there's this general fear that if we change the electricity system, we're going to lose the way our modern lives work. So there's always this sort of like tempered approach. And so how that connects to who I am is that, as I said in my intro, I've been interested in electricity from my earliest days. My science fair project in first grade, which we'll try to dig up this picture and put it somewhere, was an electric fuse. It was like, battery and steel wool and things like that to show that if you put too much electricity across a piece of metal that can't take it, then it'll burn out and it'll stop the circuit from electrocuting anyone, which is that was in first grade that I was interested in that. It's
you
unfortunate.
Were like, I need to know how electricity works from a fundamental level when I'm 6 years old. I'm going to build would you call it a battery? No.
Well, no, it was just like, it was like a 9-volt battery, and it was connected to like steel wool. And then that connected to like a brad or some other kind of metal to connect the circuit between the battery. And then once the circuit turned on, so basically once the metal touched, and completed the circuit, then there was too much electricity for the tiny strand of steel wool. So the steel wool would basically burn.
Wow.
And it would show you how, it's just, that's how a fuse worked. I mean, there was no invention in first grade, but of course
it
was just
on fire.
Oh, it would just burn. If that is how I imagine everyone should, go home and try this, of course.
Because I think what I think is so interesting about you is you understand electricity in a way that I haven't been able to grasp, even when I've been in physics class and heard over and over again how electrons move and how they flow. And I'm like, it's just magic. It's invisible. And to be able to really grasp that concept is kind of amazing to me personally.
Yeah, I only recognize that when I talk to people about it. But I'll tell you kind of how it went from first grade. I don't know if I was really focused on it when I was a kid. I wasn't doing many other things with electricity, but I do think once I got into the physics program at University of Washington, like some things started to coalesce where it was like I was pretty interested in meteorology. So I had this option to replace my nuclear physics. I didn't really do much in nuclear physics. I replaced a lot of those classes with meteorology and climatology. And it was a math-based science. And so you could kind of swap that in to your curriculum. And so there was that going on. And then I was also taking like electricity and magnetism. And I really loved the electricity and magnetism courses. I always felt like I was behind. Like I sort of was learning all these new things in the math about it. And I always felt like I was behind, but I always did well in those classes, like way better than any other of the physics classes. So clearly there was something where, whether it's my interest level or just like some like natural understanding of how it should work, whereas I think that that's not really an intuitive thing to understand how electricity should work. But just whatever exposure I had prior to college, like it sort of coalesced for me to be able to in some ways do better than I thought, despite feeling like maybe I wasn't fully, present during classes, or I wasn't studying enough, or I wasn't keeping up. And so that, the sort of swirling together of meteorology and electricity, there was sort of a logical path for me to now go into, at the time, the only field where you could be focused on both of the weather and the power grid or electricity, was renewable energy. And I can tell you that in college we were learning about like tuning electrical circuits. Like you have to tune like basically like all of the quality of the electrical circuit and like the way the electricity works has to be sort of tuned in some way by the way you design the circuit. If you don't design the circuit right, then the circuit won't work. And now it was like, oh, and now we're going to use the weather and we're going to make the electrons move with the weather. Like that was a mind-blowing concept when I was in college. It's one thing to do that on your house. It's another thing to do that in a little neighborhood or a little thing on the side. But to actually have plans to run the power grid on a variable source of power using sunshine and wind and water and all of this stuff was mind-blowing enough to hold my attention.
Yeah.
And so it's held my attention now for about 13 years.
Yeah.
And so that really, I think that kind of summarizes like who I am, because I think that curiosity, if the curiosity is quenched, I'm out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. But this is one of those problems. It's like, it's so intractable. And to think about how the system design could work, not just like at a high level and theoretically, like not a research paper, but like, how can you bring that all the way back to this moment and say, well, if you just started this way, then you could sort of somehow create some kind of flywheel or some way to accelerate us towards this future that we're all sort of, that we want, this is really cool. It's like when I got into this, I think solar panels were 100 times more expensive than they are today.
Yeah.
I mean, that's crazy. It's 99% off when I got in, 99% off a solar panel. And I just think that we're sort of at this cusp where like everybody needs to like change the way they think, including me, like constantly. Like we need to change the way we think about how this works. So and that's how I spend my days.
I love it. I know. And it makes sense. I mean, I think a lot of people, including myself, would feel overwhelmed by the problem of trying to use the weather to create the electricity, but you are inspired by it. So like kudos to you. It's like, so I think
I'm inspired by overwhelming things. I think that's
the theme. So with that in mind, what are some of the goals or hopes for the podcast?
Yeah,
if we could sum it up.
I think the hopes would be that we want to highlight some of the new technologies that aren't being discussed as much. I think we want to explore the new ideas that could help the world be more environmentally healthy and make this planet a more equitable place for people. And we want to, this one's kind of personal for me, is like I really want to make sure that we have a place for ideas and concepts to be as complicated as they need to be. Sometimes when you're solving a problem that still is in the future, it's hard to fully articulate it exactly as it should be articulated. And I think getting into the weeds on those problems and leaving the nuance there, we want to make sure that this is a place to do that. Also challenging, as you just said, challenging assumptions about what's good and bad. I think sometimes like certain energy, obviously nuclear is always brought up as this debate of whether this is good or this is bad. It's like, well, can we dig that out a little bit and be like, are there different types of nuclear, different way of making it that could be interesting, a different size of plant that could make it interesting, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And then this one's big too, is just like electricity is fundamental to every single industry now. Yeah. Like the crypto industry is always talking about like, oh, we need to help the unbanked, the 1.9 billion people who are unbanked. It's like, well, the unbanking problem in a fundamental way is an electricity problem. Not only, but if you get down to the long tail of the other people, it's like, well, if there's 1 billion people who are unbanked, mm-hmm. who also don't have electricity, it's gonna be really hard for you to hand them like a digital token and have them go pay for it at their store, right? Like there's no internet, there's no, and there are ways around this. And it's important for us to know this is not an impossible problem. This is something that could be fixed. But I think making sure that we highlight and encourage the cross-pollination between all of the industries that are needed, or that could actually help move this conversation of sustainability and kind of infrastructure system design forward.
Love it. I'm so excited.
Me too.
So wait, so let's I'd like to hear a little bit, and I guess we can go into this in more depth in future episodes, but a little bit about the evolution from Drift to Aston.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other sort of founders of companies out there who know that experience of you set out to do something and you have a vision for what you think it should be. And with Drift, it was, if we could figure out a way to write a standardized contract with a corporate offtake or some kind of buyer of renewable energy, we could use math to arrange the power sources on the other side. So we could sort of like, they could say, the buyer could say, these are my goals, as lofty as they are. And we could say, okay, here's the price to meet those goals. And then we could build a network of physical renewable energy infrastructure to then build that into this contract and meet their demands over time. So it wasn't some corporate customer saying, I want to be 100% renewable today.
Yeah.
Because I need to.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's not possible. So, and by the way, it's important for me to note, 100% renewable to me does not mean that I've offset somewhere else. It's that when I purchase electricity, I pay for it in a power bill. I look at I look at how much did I buy versus how much did I use like continuously throughout the year. I'm not saying like on average throughout the year. It's important to note. So that was the idea of Drift. Could we make it where you could subscribe to this network of renewable energy assets and you could hit your goals?
Right.
And you didn't have to do anything else besides that as a corporate buyer. Because let's be honest, like the head of sustainability at a reasonably sized, like sustainable brand has to figure out how to make sure that they have like recycled paper, recycled cups, and also renewable energy. It's like, how could this one person be responsible for doing all of these things? So it really was a service to make that pretty simple. And I think we started that company like 10 years too early, honestly. Like I'm starting to now hear of companies that are like, oh, we're kind of thinking of like a little bit of that now. Like maybe we'll just help people see how much renewable energy they should buy. And there's people like selling people these services to say, here's how much you should buy. And we were sort of 10 years early saying like, hey, we'll go buy it for you.
Right.
We weren't sort of suggesting somebody should. And so what the trouble we had with Drift was like, the thing that was missing in the market when we started it was there wasn't really like a modern infrastructure company that we could go to and say, hey, we're running this business to serve this customer set, these corporate customers. And we would kind of want to run that business model on your infrastructure. This exists in many other industries, right? Like if you want to start Spotify, for instance, you can go to these record companies or publishing companies and you can say, well, you have all of this stuff and I would like to take all of that stuff that you have and I'd like to move that into a
package,
into a product. Yeah. That people can now interact with, and it's gonna be better for you because you can get more plays. It's gonna be better for the customer. It's a better user experience, and it's good for Spotify because we're also gonna make some of that money too. You transform it from this big randomized network of supply into something that like each person can now have. the difference there is that to plug into those big aggregators for Spotify is like this sort of, I'm sure this was complicated, but it was like it existed. There was these big buckets of existing supply they could go to. And in the energy business, it was like, that really didn't exist. Like we couldn't go to, you know, a big infrastructure company and say, oh, I've got this contract with these 20 companies or 25 companies that I can't really tell you about because they don't want you to know what they use for electricity. And I need you to just like plug into our network and then we'll make sure that the people get what they want. Like that was impossible because it was just like the mindset of an infrastructure builder is still that of when Thomas Edison was building infrastructure with JP Morgan. It was like, I'm going to put in this power station and I'm going to find somebody to buy something from this power station. And that's it, 1-to-1. Like,
Yeah.
as long as I have a buyer, I can build this new infrastructure. And our thesis was like, at Drift was like, well, you don't have to do it. It's almost like you can take what the people want and what the companies want, and you could build behind that.
Right.
Not like what that company wants, but like what the network of companies want. So that was just, we were kind of too early to that conversation. I think both for the buyers and the sellers, but we had kind of a better time with the buyers. Like it was easier to kind of get them to be like, yeah, like I would rather buy renewable electricity from people who make it rather than buy some offset from a broker or something like that. You know, it felt more direct connected. It felt like they could make more of an impact if we could build behind that agreement we had with them. And so that piece that was missing, this like modern infrastructure company to serve this modern user experience that's happening in sustainability and sort of climate impact, that was missing. And so as much as we tried to fight it mentally, I think Ed and Ka and I, and then other people we started to talk to about it, different investors who had backed Drift, even some of the investors who had backed Drift, you know, we had learned so much from that experience of like, okay, well, like a modern infrastructure company is missing. How would you build it? And now it's going to look way different than anyone's going to think. When I say modern infrastructure company here, how that looks is going to look completely different than what even a lot of people will have in their minds. Even when I talk to people, they're like, well, infrastructure companies are hard. You're not going to, you know, you don't want to start that. But it's like, I feel like at this point, that narrative has to start happening. Like we have to start getting where we're fixing supply chains for certain types of fuels or technologies. Like we have to start changing the supply chains for certain fuels and technologies, whereas previously, you know, all of the supply chains are really like kind of well supported in like oil and gas, for instance. If you want to get oil and gas, like you can get that. All of this infrastructure has been built around those industries. And in some ways, even though solar and wind and, you know, various carbon-free power, you know, technologies like nuclear or green hydrogen, it's just like the infrastructure for those industries is not built. And so it's like, you're not just going to have these infrastructure companies that make 95% of their revenue from oil and gas aren't magically going to shut all of that down and then go start a new one.
Right.
And these infrastructure companies have been selling like, you know, commodities contracts, or they've been doing paper contract arrangements every 5 to 10 years. They're not magically going to turn into like a software company that interacts with, you know, the next version of Drift or whoever comes out here in the next decade. So we kind of saw that gap in the market and said, you know, there's an opportunity to build that modern infrastructure company.
So I guess that's
That
what
is Aston Labs.
Okay. And I feel like, or I know there are some components you guys can't really talk about yet. So we won't be able to flesh out the full concept of what Aston Labs is.
Right.
At this moment.
Yeah, we'll unpack that. But it's a modern infrastructure company that's going to allow for more carbon-free electricity infrastructure, but carbon-free utility networks to grow faster. We're going to use kind of the power of of software and whatever people's opinion is about crypto, I don't really care. We're going to use blockchain technology and crypto to sort of to accelerate the development of that network. And we're going to lean on the principles of like online marketplaces and online marketplace networks rather than leaning on the constructs of, traditional infrastructure companies, which really is having a public company and buying a bunch of stuff, financing a bunch of stuff. Like, it'll look different than that. But yeah, there's some things we can't talk about yet, but
it's exciting. We're going to shift into why are we making this podcast? And it's sponsored by Aston Labs. So we're going to be covering topics that would be related to the areas of infrastructure, energy, electricity, and also financing and future of contracts and finance, decentralized finance. We're going to be covering those types of topics, but not just those that pertain specifically to what Aston Labs is doing, because we're going to have all kinds of conversations about those topics, right?
Yeah, I think the thing that will always be there is that pretty much anything we talk about, whether directly or indirectly, comes back to electricity. Like, if we talk about agriculture or food supply chains, in some way they're all going to come back to, how does the infrastructure network, what's the infrastructure that supports that network? That's always going to be there. We're always going to be coming back to what's the physical stuff that has to be in the world to support these initiatives. I think sometimes that gets missed. I hear so many cool software companies that are out there. Oh, we're working in regenerative agriculture, or we're working in climate impact for corporations, and we're working in optimizing battery storage for the power grid, and we're working in all these different categories. It's like, okay, well, what is the infrastructure that needs to be there for you to scale faster?
Right.
Can this not be a 10-year journey? Can this be a 6-month journey? And what kind of infrastructure network has to exist? And if you had a partner, or if you had a network that you could go to that saw the world the way you do, and didn't have like 95% of the revenue coming from
oil and
your competitors,
right? Yeah.
Then maybe
maybe it would act different.
Maybe it could happen way faster than what you think it could.
And I mean, brass tacks here. I'm a human being on planet Earth in 2022, and my power goes out sometimes. And it's not a good feeling.
No.
Because you're like, I don't have a generator yet. I'll probably get one. I'd rather have a solar panel and a battery, but we're dependent on the grid. Do that. And anyway, it's just, and it's like, it's not even a hurricane. The power goes out. It's like it's like raining and the power goes out. It's like, what the heck is going on? So it's like, neither of us probably know, more than I do, but we may not know the real, actual, tangible reason for that. But it's a symptom of a bigger problem, which is we're putting everything on the grid. All the cars are going electric. We'll have flying cars that are electric. We'll have, everything will be electric. And the power grid probably needs an update. Even if we didn't care about sustainability and equitable futures for all people, we're going to have to change it anyway. So why don't we change it the best way possible?
Yeah.
With our values and ideal future in mind.
Yeah, it's a big job. Basically, the thing that's kind of funny about this, about being in sustainability, as you already know, in that field, if that should even be called a field, sort of like more of
survival,
more of a value. Yeah.
I'd like to survive and live a healthy life, and I bet other people would like to as well.
Yeah, and after I live, I'd like to continue living.
I'd like my children to live.
Yeah.
And not choke from pollution and die from heat when cold and extreme weather. Yeah,
I think it doesn't ever feel like you're competing with somebody who's also working on this. Like, that's what's sort of interesting. Why I hesitate to call sustainability a field or climate impact like a field. Because in a field, you usually have competitors, and like it's sort of, even though, yeah, you're competing in terms of like who's going to get revenue and who's not going to get revenue. It's like, there's still always this sort of overarching feeling that you're on the same team, even though maybe you're competing for deals. But I think the thing about power going out, I mean, I think the most challenging thing about answering that question is like, where are you in the world? Like in some cases where you are in the world, it's like you might have no electricity. That's like still a real thing.
Right. Which
to a lot of people is mind-boggling that we're, talking about the electricity talking about the electricity applications or the things that are going to run on the power grid in the United States, let's say, versus some people don't like have any electricity service at all in their homes still in parts of the world. And that can be for political reasons. I mean, there's like any number of reasons that is happening, but at the end of the day, it's that the amount of electricity that's on the grid doesn't equal the amount of electricity that's trying to get pulled from the grid. So at a fundamental level, it's like anybody who knows deeply about how the power grid works is going to hate that I just said that. But at the end of the day, it's like supply and demand is not getting met, and that's why your power is going out. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, and even with like if the wind is blowing or whatever, there's something fundamentally wrong with like the system design. You could have above ground wires, like modern neighborhoods are burying wires, especially if there's chances of like wind or hurricanes. There's that story that we saw about that community in Florida. I think I actually know the name now. I think it's called Babcock Ranch.
Yes.
Is it called Babcock Ranch?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Cool. I didn't know the name of it when we were talking about it before. But that community, sort of like got through Hurricane Ian, despite its proximity to places that completely went out for weeks. They were able to keep the lights on. And I think it's just like it's like a system architecture that we now have the technology for, but you're always running up against like what's already there. Yeah. Inertia is a wicked competitor. So, and our
power companies are huge. They're giant, and there's only 2 of them maybe in each market.
Yeah. I mean, there's very few, like
1 or 2 options.
We won't get too much in the weeds on that, but yeah, like the people actually running the physical infrastructure system, they call like natural monopolies, which is like, I don't want 40 different companies' wires running down the street. It's better to just have one company's wires running down the street. And so, but yeah, that's a whole stack of like 100 and something odd years worth of regulatory shifts and changes. And
we got to start somewhere.
You got to start somewhere. The other challenge, I will say, for utilities, and this is not really of any fault of their own, it's like they exist to serve the masses, these utility companies that are built. When you, the company, are meant to serve the masses, and you've spent the whole time in your career like pushing supply to the buyers, the demand, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, now the demand's going to make a little supply and put it back into your grid. And then you're like, oh, wait, we're not ready for that. Let's like sort of not do too much of that.
Yeah.
So now it's like, we're going to control how much that can happen. And then, which I usually refer to this as like power 1.0, power 2.0, power 3.0, or, is like power 1.0 was like just push. It was like the utility pushed power, all good. And then renewable energy, a little bit of like deregulation, or just like allowing people to sort of make their own power who were not the utilities. Now it was like, it's power 2.0. That's like, oh, now a little bit of those buyers, those homeowners, those commercial buildings, those independent private companies are going to start to push stuff onto the grid. Mm-hmm. And the utility didn't have control of that. They sort of had to allow it to happen. Mm-hmm. But they're still in control. They're just sort of letting it happen. And then power 3.0 would be like, where we are now, which is like now people want to put as much power onto the grid as they want to. They don't really want anybody to say, they don't want the utility to say, well, you can't do that because I have this coal plant over here that I have to pay off. Like nobody's hearing that anymore. It's like, no, you don't understand. I want that coal plant out of here. Like shut it down tomorrow,
right?
And we'll make enough to make up for the rest. So as I'm saying this, you can tell that like almost none of this has to do with the physical infrastructure. It's all about the people involved and the stakeholders it's your wheelhouse. It's the politics.
Right.
It's the politics and the regulatory that are. So I say all of that to say that it is so much more complicated about why power stays on and why power goes out than we will probably ever be able to dig into. But we are going to try our best to have certain guests on to explore some of those topics where they're trying to solve the problem or where they just really understand the problem. It's good for us to hear where there's just like intractable problems.
We're going to keep learning. We're not going to assume that we know everything ever.
Right.
Even if we're trying to build the next infrastructure company, which we are, or you are, we are going to keep the conversation going. We're going to be open to learning new things, challenging our assumptions. So love it. I'm so excited.
Me too.
I'm also really honored to be on this journey with you.
Me too.
It's going to be fun. we all have our assumptions and our biases that are formed by our experiences, but I like to try really hard to be open-minded. And I think we both care a lot about progress and outcomes over optics, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard in that moment when you're going to say something that's like, this is sort of the outcome we're looking for. And then like you said, everybody has their concrete ideas. I used to say, it's like, I guess I sort of tell my kids this, every idea or every belief that someone has, like every category is sort of like this like container. Let's say it's like a glass, this belief. And then like some people have filled that belief up with concrete, and there's just no way of getting anything new into that belief. Like it's just concrete.
Right.
The best example is actually like titles in companies. There's sort of like these ideas, like the CEO is like this idea that most people sort of have like a concrete understanding of what that role is. And I could tell you, as like having that title on a business card a couple times now in my life, the person actually living inside of that title doesn't look at that very concretely at all.
Right.
It's like, it's sort of this constantly, it's like an amorphous, where it's sort of like this fluid that is just like constantly churning over. And I think all of this should be like, as we're trying to design, it's like everyone has theirs. Like nuclear is this idea that has like many people have already filled that idea up with concrete. It's like they have a concrete understanding of what it is. And if you want to change that, then it's like, sorry.
Too late.
You're going to have to chip that thing with a jackhammer.
For a long time.
For a long time to get me to change my mind on that. And I think if going back to the hope of this podcast, if this podcast has to be the jackhammer that just chips away at people's concrete ideas of what exists in what it's going to take.
And maybe, and also brings in new boxes.
Yeah. Yeah. Brings in things we haven't thought about before.
Things that bring in ideas and technologies that people don't even know are out there that could be brought into the equation.
Yep.
Sorry. Yeah. I cut you off. I didn't mean to cut you off. You said you were happy to be the jackhammer.
Yeah, I'm happy if we have to be the jackhammer. I'm also happy if we have to be the people that help to discover new, just completely new containers. And we'll try to stay away from analogies and metaphors as much as we possibly can.
Well, I mean, no. Analogies are so helpful, though. It's just, there's lots of times when they're helpful. And then there's some times where they're destructive. Yeah,
there's sometimes where they sort of smooth over the nuances that are essential to actually have a conversation. So we'll choose wisely.
We'll try to be careful with how many analogies we make, and we can't promise perfection, but
yeah,
we'll try.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's
All right.
good for the introduction. Anything
Onward.
else you want to add?
No.
All right.
Let's get started. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the World Changing Podcast. Our first full episode is coming soon. Be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, to hear the latest episodes.